Three, two, one. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our final Be More Human series event for the year 21-22. And with this event, we're going to cover the racial history of the Presbytery of Baltimore in the Loop churches. But today, we're going to focus on our chapter 1, the racial history of Baltimore City. And this is brought to you by the Inner Loop Ministry Group of the Presbytery of Baltimore. And today's agenda. Oh, by the way, I'm Kenny Walker. I'm the convener for the Inner Loop Ministry Group. And before we go to our agenda for today, let's open up in prayer. Let us pray. Dear Lord, as we gather here for this Be More Human series event, let us enter this with open heart and open minds to let you, Lord, into our hearts, where as we look in the mirror of our racial history in the city of Baltimore, that we look at ourselves in a way that we will want to improve. By the work of your Son, Jesus Christ, he always wants us to serve others, to be the best that we can be, and in turn, follow the example of him. So with this event tonight, let us continue to do that. Let us work towards us being closer to Jesus and God. These things I ask in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, who's our Lord and Savior. Amen. All righty. So we're going to break up the event in three parts. The first part, we're going to talk about chapter 1 with our presenter, our researcher, Damella. Second part, we're going to have an open forum. And in the open forum, we want to discuss your racial experiences in Baltimore City. And then part 3 is what's next. After parts 1 and 2, how do we work forward? How do we move forward to make Baltimore and the surrounding areas a better place? So that's our agenda for today. So in starting, want to talk more about the Presbytery of Baltimore ministry groups. And there are 6 of them. You have the Wild Wild West, which on your screen, you'll see is the purple churches to the far left. And you have the Susquehanna Parish, which is like the green churches that on your top far right. You have the North Baltimore Presbyterians, which are the light blue, which is just above the city of Baltimore. I think I did that wrong. Okay, but you have the Bay Area Disciples, which are the navy blue, which is in the Annapolis area. And then the West Side Story, which are the green that's to the, not the far right, but the middle right. And then you have the ITL. And the ITL, the church is located densely in the middle of the screen, and Baltimore City, which are in the purple. And what the ministry groups do and what their mission is we have missional engagement with the community. And these are the things that our vision for our ministry groups. Congregational development, Christian formation and leadership development, prophetic witness and action for reconciliation, and also forming of new faith communities. Now, since we are the In the Loop Ministry Group, we are consisted of 12 churches. Now, as you can see on the map, location of the churches, there are Knox Presbyterian Church, Hunton Ridge Presbyterian Church, Henwood, Brown Memorial, Madison Avenue, Lockern, Grace, Cherry Hill Community, Dickey Memorial, First and Franklin, Light Street, and Trinity. These are the churches that we're going to focus on this research project. So, the overview of goals of our ITL Racial History Project. Okay, our grant goals was the congregational and leader development and action for reconciliation. And through engaging church leaders in the dialogue and discovery of each congregation's story related to its racial past and present. And the other vision, other goal was the missional engagement and prophetic witness. As revelation of historic actions promotes engagement and action to address church and reorientation towards racial justice if needed. And the funding for this grant was $5,500 from the Presbyterian of Baltimore. Now, like I said, the reason for the project was to engage a researcher to conduct primary and secondary research into the racial histories of our ITL churches. Now, during our grant proposal, originally we was looking at $2,500 and 100 hours for the researcher to do their job. But with the little arm twisting, Reverend Devin McAkron, we were able to increase that to 200 hours and $5,000. So when we approached Presbyterian Baltimore with our proposal, they were so, how would you say, they were so enlightened. They were so encouraged about our proposal that they also added an additional $500 for our researcher to go to the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia. So that's how we came up with the $5,500 grant. So isn't God good? Started out with 100 hours, ended up with 200 hours and $5,500. And now our ITL Racial History Project team is myself, Kenneth Walker, Annette Snyder from Hunton Ridge, Sharice Jordan Moore from Knox, and Reverend Devin McAkron from Hunton Ridge. And our primary researcher and writer is Miss Damella Dotan. And I want to give you a little bio of Damella Dotan. Damella was born and raised in New York City. She attained her Bachelor of bachelor's degree at Swarthmore College in 2015, and her master's degree at the Maryland Institute College of Art in social design in 2020. But during that time, she has done a lot as far as community involvement and community engagement. In the years of 2015, 2016, she was a core member in the Trinity Service Corps. And that was she lived in a group setting with 6 other fellows and learned about the Episcopal tradition and how to live and serve justly and compassionately. From 2015 to 2017, she worked with Avodah, the Jewish Service Corps. And that's a group that works to promote social and economic justice in America. Also in 2018, in her hometown in New York, she worked as a volunteer with New Sanctuary Coalition. And this is a group that pairs immigrants with United States citizens so those citizens can attend legal proceedings with the immigrants and help them through the process. And then with her time in DC from 2016 to the present, she was an organizer for SURJ, which stands for Showing Up for Racial Justice. And as an organizer, she organized and facilitated trainings and phone banks to recruit and onboard new members. She planned meetings, facilitated meetings, and just did a whole lot, and what she is still doing for showing up for racial justice. And in 2021, during her time at MICA, we were able to connect and hire her as our researcher and for tonight's presenter of this evening's event. So without any more delay, keep me from talking anymore, now I give you Ms. Damella Dotan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Kenny, for this very, very wonderful introduction. And it's really been an honor to work with you and Annette, as well as other folks in ITL, Charisse, Jordan Moore, and Reverend Deborah McAfrin. It's been really wonderful experience. And I feel like I've been welcomed so warmly into this community, so thank you. So I'll start out in this slide talking about the methods of the research project. So I started off with primary research, conducting interviews with different members of the churches, as well as different reverends and elders. And I also conducted a lot of secondary research. I looked at different ITL church archives, such as pictures, session minutes, budgets, etc. I read books about the history of Baltimore, newspaper and journal articles, and I went to the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia, which was amazing. And I got to just nerd out over all the history there. So that was wonderful. So we're starting out with chapter 1, how we got here and where we are now. And so the chapter 1 of this racial history project will serve as a foundational background for the rest of the project, explaining how race as a legacy of slavery has manifested in Baltimore City. And in subsequent chapters, we'll refer back to chapter 1 to show how different racially related events and movements have played out and brought us to where we are today in Baltimore. So just a quick note, the Baltimore town was established in 1729. It was formerly native land, and I want to acknowledge that. And in 1797, Baltimore was officially incorporated as a city. And Baltimore in Maryland was a slave state, so there were enslaved people living, working in Baltimore, as well as many free Black people as well. So in the early 19th century, we see the population growth of the city of Baltimore. It had the largest free Black population of any American city. And this increase in free Black population was in large part due to the widespread practice of manumission, which means the release from slavery. And this was practiced both with and without due process, or like it was with or without official notice or official papers. And this suggests that in early Baltimore, there wasn't a ton of importance placed on having official papers. And that meant that people could have a bit more anonymity and be able to live in the city and there was a bit more of a nuance between free and enslaved. And this made the culture very distinct from other Southern slaveholding American cities. So the abolition movement definitely was a very big part, played a very big part in Baltimore racial history. There were different, especially with the religious institutions, such as the Quaker and African Methodist Episcopal churches, which were very prominent in Baltimore Black community. They really played a big part in helping formerly enslaved people get to freedom. And this kind of activism lasted until the Civil War. So in the antebellum period, there was a continuation of organizing for abolition, as well as the right to have an education. And in this time period, there were no public schools for Black Baltimoreans, only for whites. And that was a real issue because Black Baltimoreans, free Black Baltimoreans paid taxes, but yet they were not being given the city services that they were paying for. And there was also a growing fear of insurrection that increased throughout the decades until the Civil War. So a huge turning point in regards to this fear of insurrection was Nat Turner's Rebellion, which happened in Southampton, Virginia in 1831. And there was a huge backlash on the part of the Maryland legislature, which had a lot of white, well, it was all white. It had slave holding representatives, and they were invested in maintaining the status quo. And so they were afraid that not only enslaved Black people, but also free Black people would have a violent insurrection. And so they created a bunch of legislation and that barred free Black Marylanders, for instance, from owning firearms without a certificate from county officials. and were also prohibited from buying alcohol, powder, or shot. And except in Baltimore City, the new law prohibited both free and enslaved Black people from holding religious meetings without a white minister present. But even in Baltimore, they imposed a curfew of 10 p.m. So Blacks' freedom to meet was still restricted. And along with passing laws to effectively re-enslave free Black people, the state sought to resettle free Blacks through the colonization movement. And this was a movement that sought to deport free Black people to Liberia. And in 1831, following the rebellion, the state increased its funding for the American Colonization Society with an annual grant of $10,000 a year for 20 years. And this was a real insult to Black people living in Baltimore because this was their home and they put a lot of labor into the city and love, and it was where their community was. And so there was a lot of organizing to resist this movement. And much of it was led by Black religious leaders, such as William S. Watkins. And he wrote in William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, that he'd rather live under unrighteous and cruel laws at home than be driven like cattle to Liberia. So the Civil War in Baltimore was a really interesting time because it did not emancipate from the Union. And as a border state, it was invested in maintaining interest with both the North and the South. And it actually had the first bloodshed of the Civil War. So because there were many Confederate sympathizers who lived in Baltimore, a riot broke out when a bunch of Union soldiers were transferring trains on the way to Washington, D.C. And several soldiers were killed. And then the Union Army occupied the city and captured Federal Hill. And they instilled martial law in the city and suspended habeas corpus. And they outlawed the expression of any pro-Confederate sympathy. And they did this to prevent Maryland from seceding from the Union. And they didn't end up seceding from the Union. And then because they didn't, the enslaved people were not emancipated, but the Maryland with the Emancipation Proclamation, but the Maryland legislature voted in 1864 to abolish slavery. So Reconstruction Baltimore, in this time period, many different groups and activists, advocates for racial justice in Baltimore advocated, they used their newfound freedom to organize for more freedom, for justice, and for their rights. And they started advancing politically, and they had more legal and social rights than they had before, especially with the 15th Amendment being ratified. But there was also a backlash that followed on the part of white Baltimoreans, and this led to the start of the Jim Crow laws later on. So different people, different organizations and institutions of Black Baltimore, including religious leaders and labor organizers, Union Army veterans, joined together. And an example is George Hackett. He was an abolitionist and Bethel AME church member. And he founded the Douglas Institute to promote education for African Americans and to provide a meeting space for members of the Black community. And Other religious institutions, such as the Sharp Street Church, organized educational programs for Black educators. So other types of advancements were the founding of the first Black trade union, when Isaac Myers founded that in 1865. And in this time period, there was an increase of white immigrants, and they had a lot of the same racial resentments as the white Baltimore natives who were there earlier. And they won a strike calling for Black hawkers to be excluded from shipyards where they had historically worked in Baltimore. And in response, Isaac Myers and other Bethel AME Church member laymen organized the Cooperative Chesapeake and Marine Railway and Dry Dock Company, which employed 300 skilled Black workers. And in 1868, Myers organized the Colored Caulkers Trade Union Society and the Colored National Labor Union in 1869, following white workers' exclusion of Black workers from the new National Labor Union. And also at this time, we see in 1866, Baltimore City opened its first schools for non-white students. And then in 1867, the Maryland legislature first considered legalizing Black jurors serving on juries involving white defendants. And that ended up becoming the law in 1880 with the Supreme Court case Strouder versus West Virginia. And then in 1870, the ratification of the 15th Amendment added 39,000 new Black voters to the total of 131,000 white voters registered in the state of Maryland. So just to clarify, the Jim Crow era, it lasted way beyond 1920 until about 1965, and even somewhat beyond that. But we wanted to mark this time period as being the start of a lot of these Jim Crow laws that instituted legal segregation throughout the South and throughout the country. And so I just want to make it clear that it's not only in this time period, but this was a specific time period where there was a lot of racist sentiment, and especially in Baltimore, that's when a lot of these laws ended up being passed. So in 1904, a big moment in Baltimore was the Great Fire, which destroyed a lot of downtown Baltimore. And after the fire, the city ended up building new roads, which were much wider than they had been before. And that let more traffic flow through the city with at that time, new automobiles. And there's also the streetcar, which had just been built in the past few decades. And that led to further expansion out of the city because people could travel around a bit more. And this ended up also being the beginning of white flight, because white people would start to move when they saw that Black people were moving into their neighborhood, when these Black people who were moving just wanted to live in a better place with better conditions. And in the 1900s, we see the increase of segregated institutions and the attempt to disenfranchise Black voters. And in the late 1800s, the Democratic Party regained power in Baltimore, and they were at that time, the less progressive party. So they were also the party of that supported slavery throughout the 1800s. And they have had a stronghold in Baltimore, and they regained power and tried to disenfranchise Black voters 3 times in the first decade of the century. And luckily, these attempts were not fruitful, but there was still a big push of institutional segregation during this time. So institutions such as theaters and parks started becoming officially segregated. So a big moment in Baltimore racial history was 1910. So in 1910, lawyer Ashby Hawkins moved into the formerly all-white Druid Hill neighborhood on McCullough Street. And that really added to the racial fears and tensions among white Baltimoreans. And they freaked out basically, and neighbors looted their house, and the neighbors formed a protected association, which lobbied the city council to impose residential segregation. And they lobbied the city council, as I said, to pass the segregation law. And I just want to note that this is the original building that they moved into in 1910, that his family moved into. And there's a mural here. And then in 1911, that's when they first tried to pass Ordinance 610, which was the first municipal segregation law in the country. And in 1913, it was passed finally. And Ashby Hawkins, as a lawyer, actually was successful in defeating the law the first 2 times. And it was struck down in 1917 by Stogas decision, which struck down a similar law in Lexington, Kentucky. And it had also inspired many other similar laws throughout the country. So in the pre-civil rights era, this was the time period from around 1920 to 1954. There was a continuation of white flight, and the response to this Ordinance 610 being struck down was the racially restrictive covenants, which is where different communities would basically have in their real estate charter or their community charter that they would not accept people of certain races. So that ended up becoming the way that they would continue to impose racial segregation. There's also advocacy against lynching and advocacy for fair housing and for integration, as well as for education integration and education opportunities for Black Baltimoreans. And here's a rough timeline of some of the events that happened in this time period. So we have redlining in 1937, wartime workers coming to Baltimore in the 40s, and segregated public housing. Then the 1948 referendum and 1949 Stogas case, Shelley versus Kramer, which legally ended enforcement of racially restricted covenants. So redlining had a huge impact on Baltimore and on how race in Baltimore affected who could live where. And this is here a map of a red line map of Baltimore from 1937. So because of the Great Depression, the federal government mapped out several American cities, including Baltimore, outlining their ethnic distribution, and then they assigned different colored values to each neighborhood. So then they were divided into real estate value categories, such as green, blue, yellow, and red. And these maps purportedly were created to prevent the federal government and private institutions from being exposed to risky loans. And I want to note here that a large part of the negative reaction from 2 decades earlier when Ashby Hawkins moved into the Druid Hill neighborhood was because there was a myth perpetuated, oftentimes by the Baltimore Sun, by people in charge in Baltimore, that having Black neighbors brought down property value. And so even though there was no evidence that this was true, they still kept saying that it was true and people believed it. And that is a large part of why people did not want neighborhood integration. They did not want to live near people of different races. And so unfortunately, redlining ended up making this myth true because they saw that because people who were going to be living, who were in these non-green line neighborhoods did end up having lower property values. And so I wanted to note that. And so the red line neighborhoods were neighborhoods with high concentration of Black, Jewish, and Mexican residents. And they had a much harder time getting mortgages from standard banking institutions. And the repercussions on ability of Black and other BIPOC Americans are till this day for fair housing opportunities. So World War II in Baltimore, during this time, many people came to Baltimore for jobs, such as at the Bethlehem Steel Mill pictured here. And many Black migrants came from the South. And Baltimore built segregated public housing to accommodate newcomers. And they often built the housing for Black people in neighborhoods that were near an incinerator or other land that was not in a healthy place near trash.
If we can just hold on, thank you.
Okay, great. So continuing on, in 1948, Maryland voted yes on question 5. So Maryland voters approved a state constitutional amendment that required any land expansion in Baltimore be approved by residents already living in the annexation area. And this had a really significant impact on Baltimore City because it meant that people who were able to leave, who were mostly white and who had the means to move into more expensive suburban housing, that tax base was leaving the city. And so that left Baltimore with a lot less resources to be able to provide services for the people who stayed behind, who were not generally able to afford housing, or they needed more services from the city. And this also reflected a general trend at the time where there was less favor for city central government providing services for people who are living there, and more in favor of suburbia and spreading out from the city. And then in 1949, Shelley versus Kramer Scobus decision made it so that racially restricted covenants were unenforceable in court. And that didn't make them illegal, but it made them unenforceable in court, which is slightly different. But at that time, many of the covenants had expired by that point anyway. And many Black Baltimoreans started to move into what had been white neighborhoods, but they were still held back because of practices such as redlining and blockbusting. And so blockbusting is like a practice where real estate agents who were usually allied with banking institutions, they would basically trend forecast and see which neighborhoods were shifting demographically. So if they saw that a neighborhood was shifting and a lot of white people are leaving for the suburbs and Black people were moving into those neighborhoods, they would take advantage of that switch, and they would take advantage of the racial fears of white people and buy their houses at a very low price and then sell it very much upmarked to Black buyers. And then that meant that because it was a pay to own scheme, that a lot of people who moved into these buildings, a lot of Black people were not able to afford the upkeep because a lot of them were very old buildings and they required a lot of maintenance. So they ended up having to be kicked out, or the banking institutions ended up kicking them out, and then selling it again to another Black family. So that's how they continue to make a profit, basically. And this practice it's complicated because on one hand, it was very exploitative, and on the other hand, it did provide an opportunity for Black Baltimoreans to move into houses that they wouldn't have been able to afford otherwise, because they wouldn't have been able to afford a mortgage for it. So this era was the civil rights and Black power era. So we have different important events that happened there. The 1954 Brown v. Board Scobus decision, the civil rights integration protests against the highway to nowhere, the Baltimore riot, and the Black Power movement in Baltimore. So talking about school integration in Baltimore, it was definitely a very complicated process, and it was more complicated before Brown v. Board. There was a lot of advocacy around it, and then the city finally integrated in 1954. However, a lot of the schools, even though the city complied with the decision, a lot of the schools ended up remaining segregated because they districted the schools, which meant that people could only go to school near where they lived, and there was residential segregation, so it didn't end up actually becoming integrated in terms of schooling. And so in the 1960s, we had a lot of different civil rights protests, such as the 1961 Freedom Rides along Route 40. And they were joined, these two groups, SIG, Civic Interest Group, and CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, joined with Morgan State students and achieved desegregation along Route 40, different institutions, such as restaurants. And in the early 60s, there were many coordinated protests of student activists and civil rights groups, and this led to a slew of desegregation among Baltimore institutions from around 1960, 61 to 1963. And here we have one of the student activists, and she was at Morgan State at the time, and there were many of the Morgan State students ended up coordinating protests with NAACP and CORE, and this was a picture of the Reed sit-ins in 1961, which desegregated Reed downtown in Baltimore. And in 1963, we have a very famous protest, the Gwynn Oak Park protest. And that was a coalition of many different activist groups, many different religious leaders, and many of whom ended up being arrested at the time. But Gwynn Oak Park, which had been segregated, ended up desegregating that summer. And we also have civil rights organizing with groups such as CORE, and the quote from him detailing how the civil rights battles were involved in the neighborhood, addressing issues such as housing, unemployment, and lack of opportunities. And I want to add that during this time period, because of there was a period, this was the period of deindustrialization in Baltimore, and there were a huge amount of manufacturing job loss. So it was harder and harder for people in Baltimore to get jobs that had previously paid a decent wage before. So in 1968, there were the Baltimore City riots, which Farrar, who is a student activist on the left, had warned about, that because of these lack of opportunities and because of the really degraded conditions that Black Baltimoreans had to live in, because their communities were being disinvested from, they didn't have the same opportunities to live in safe places that white Baltimoreans had. Those tensions and emotions were high, and that at some point there would be a breaking point. And then in 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and that ended up leading to riots throughout the country. And after the protests turned, there was looting downtown after Martin Luther King Jr. died. The mayor instituted a curfew, and then the governor sent in the National Guard, which occupied the city for 5 days. And here's a picture on the right. So the Black Power movement was also really prevalent in Baltimore. from 1968 to 1972, the Black Panther chapter held a lot of community space in East Baltimore, and they held political education classes and provided a free breakfast and lunch program. And they served as an information hub for the Black Baltimoreans in the neighborhood. And we had groups such as Civic Interest Group, and we had, and the leader of the Civic Interest Group, he basically said that we needed to be more radical in the approach, and the CIG ended up holding voter drives and endorsing candidates, as well as organizing to influence local politics. And there's the charter there. And we have other groups as well that were active in the movement, such as U-Join, Brother Rescuers, SCLC, Black Feminique, which is a Black feminist organization pictured to the right. And then in the late 20th century, we see a lot of an increase of, or a decrease in resourcing the city, because a lot of the programs that have given resource to Baltimore City were cut by Nixon and Reagan administration. And there's also the first Black mayor of Baltimore was elected. And in 1995, ACLU filed Thompson versus HUD case, stating that there was a lack of fair housing opportunities in Baltimore. And this slide here, we can see how the population shifted during this time. So during the 70s, the city actually went from being a majority white to being a majority Black city. And that was a big turning point in the demographics of the city. And it also went from being the second largest city to decreasing, and then during the subsequent decades shrank to become the 30th largest city. So that was a huge point in the movement of deindustrialization and disinvestment from the city of Baltimore. And then in 1987, we had the first Black mayors who were elected, Clarence Burns and then Kurt Schmoke in 1988. And every mayor since then, except one, has been Black. And then in 1995, we had the court case Thompson versus HUD. The LDF and ACLU filed a lawsuit against HUD claiming racial discrimination in housing programs. And in the contemporary era, Baltimore City has been responding to many of the same racial problems that have been recurring over the past 200 plus years, such as unequal housing and racially discriminatory policing practices. And here we can see from 2020 the protests responding to the murder of George Floyd. In 2020, we can see this is the racial distribution in Baltimore City from the 2010 US Census. And we can see what has been termed the white L and the Black butterfly, and how that has played out in terms of who gets to live where and who gets to live in which resource neighborhoods. And so you have the term redlining, and we also have the term greenlining, which means that certain neighborhoods are invested in, and those end up being mostly white, and then some neighborhoods are divested from, and those end up being mostly black. So we have here the responses to racist policing. So in the contemporary era in Baltimore and the United States, there have been a slew of protests responding to modern day lynching by police of Black people. In 2015, the police murdered Freddie Gray in Baltimore, leading to a slew of protests in the city asking for accountability. And these protests made national news, and that greatly moved the conversation about racist policing throughout the nation. And then in 2020, there was another national wave of protests in response to the murder of George Floyd, including in Baltimore City, which is pictured on the left. And so more about Freddie Gray and the response to policing in Baltimore. So in terms of funding, we can see Baltimore ranks 12%, police violence 55%, and law enforcement approach 43%. And what it means to be a higher scoring city is less force, more officer accountability, and fewer arrests for low-level offenses, and less money for policing. So also talking about housing justice in 21st century Baltimore. So in 2005, the 95 case of Thompson versus HUD was decided upon, and it meant that they needed to provide, the HABC had to provide new housing opportunities for over 3,000 impacted families, both at redeveloped former public high-rise sites, also at different site houses in income diverse neighborhoods throughout the Baltimore metropolitan region. And the Baltimore Housing Mobility Program was one of the nation's largest relocation initiatives, and that was rolled out discreetly. And the program operates as inconspicuously as possible. As they say, it's to avoid any political and community opposition that halted HUD's move to Opportunity for Fair Housing program, which was aimed at relocating low-income families during the early 90s. And in 2011, 3 county residents, the Baltimore County branch of the NAACP and Baltimore Neighborhoods, Inc., filed a housing discrimination complaint against Baltimore County under the Federal Fair Housing Act. And this complaint accused the county of perpetuating segregated clusters of renters with government subsidies by not implementing policies to expand affordable options in more well-to-do neighborhoods. And then in 2016, after they've been negotiating for several years, the Baltimore County agreed to set up a $30 million fund to help build 1,000 homes for low-income African-American families in prosperous county neighborhoods and start a mobility program modeled after the current program. In 2016, Mayor Rawlings Blake and the City Council approved Sagamore TIF, and that authorized almost $140 million in park spending for the Port Covington project at the corner of the White L. And this is 3 times the entire amount to be spent on park and recreation for the entire city. And this would provide access to more nutritious foods and recreation centers and equitable spending on public parks. And that would have helped residents in Black Butterfly neighborhoods lower different comparatively higher rates of hypertension, heart disease, and other public health issues. And in the early 2016, the Housing for All Coalition drafted charter amendment language for legal approval of the ballot measure, and the diverse coalition of Baltimore organizations from housing advocacy groups and other groups mobilized to petition the amendment for referendum. And this was passed and overwhelmingly, and that established the AHTF. And in 2017, the city approved the allocation of 10 million in future bond money to fund affordable housing initiatives. And it's not explicitly directed to AHTF, and it's less than what they wanted, that the Community Land Trust and Baltimore Housing Roundtable wanted. But the housing commissioner acknowledged that, and saying that they're going to continue fighting for affordable housing. So these are some of the conversations around housing at this time, and trying to make it so that everyone has access to housing despite all the inequality that has come before and that has made it so that it's the way that it is, that there's segregation and that there's different neighborhoods with different levels of investment from the city and the country. And so these are the conversations that are going on now. And we can see just from some of the history that we've gone over how the past policies have led to the current policies that are happening. And so thank you all for listening to this. I know it's a lot of information, but I really appreciate you hanging in there because I believe it's important information and it's important for us to know how we got to where we are. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Kenny, and thank you.
And thank you, Damella. I'd like to say she has worked hard and long to try to put this research project together. And remember, this is just one part. The second part is how our ITL churches responded and what their part is in our racial history of Baltimore. Now we're going to the open forum. So we would like, we want to open it up and want you, our audience, to please briefly share racial events that you remember or experienced during your life in Baltimore. So can we get the gallery view so we can see? Here we go. And are there any questions or any stories that you have about your racial experiences in Baltimore City? You could raise your hand or unmute yourself. There you go, Annette. Okay, Annette.
I'm just going to quickly tell a story that I've told many of you before. I grew up in Baltimore, and in the around 1965 or so, we moved to the Forest Park neighborhood. And when we moved there, the neighborhood was still at least 50% Jewish. That was the middle of the fourth grade. a year and a half later, by the time I started the 6th grade, the neighborhood was completely Black. I had one neighbor who was a Jewish couple, an older Jewish couple that had a son who had intellectual difficulties, and they had not moved, but a whole community of people had moved. Wayland Baptist Church used to be a synagogue. Progressive Baptist Church at Forest Park in Garrison had been a synagogue. But the reason this story strikes me is how intentional a transition that was. And I think what's really important about what we talked about today is that these events didn't just happen. They were part of people's deliberate planning and thinking, and this is still going on. I think sometimes we just sort of go with the flow and we make up our own narratives about what we think the problems are or why the problems exist. I've had many a conversation with folks about how Black people tear up houses and neighborhoods without thinking about the underlying economic and social dynamics of what's really going on in the infrastructure. So I'm really appreciative of this view of the history that we've had today to help us understand where we are, and that what's going on in the world right now today is working towards determining where we're going to be in 10, 20 years, and hopefully it'll be in a better place than we are now.
Oh, thank you, Annette. Thank you. I know there are some people here in the audience who have experienced the 1960s here in Baltimore and the 70s. So we're going to ask you to unmute, and if you have any stories to tell, can you tell those stories? Thank you. So anyone?
I will share. This is Sarah Walker. Probably when I was about 12, a group of white ministers, some group from a church, took me and my cousin out to some event that was out in the suburbs area. And my thinking now is that it was on Route 40. And so we stopped at a restaurant and they were going to get us something to eat. And they brought us into the restaurant, and the the person who was to seat us told us they didn't serve colored people in there. So it was kind of embarrassing to them. They took us back to the car and said, these are the things that we are trying to change. And so they asked us what we wanted, and they did go into the restaurant and bring it back to us. So that was my first time that I had heard that we don't serve colored people in here. And it's something you do remember.
I'm going to ask Sharice Jordan Moore.
Yes. Hi, Kenny. I just wanted to share, since this is a Presbytery event, that the Gwen Oak Amusement Park that we talked about in the presentation, that people from Knox did participate in that demonstration, and Reverend Herman Octavius Graham, who was pastor then, did take a group of people to the demonstration, and my husband participated in it, in fact, and was among the first to be thrown in the paddy wagon there at the demonstration. And then the people who he had his, I believe, first job working at a car wash. And when they saw him in the paper, then he lost that job as a young man. And he also tells a story like Sarah of living in West Baltimore. And I guess there was a car mechanic who had a place there who was a white gentleman. And my husband and his son played together. And then one day the father gave them some money to go down and get French fries from a place called the White Coffee Pot. And so they took their, little money down to the White Coffee Pot and set up to the counter. And the waitress told them, oh, well, we can't serve you here. And so they both got down and she said, oh, no, no, honey, to the little white boy, you can eat here, but, he can't, meaning my husband. So, and I think that I just had lunch today with somebody who grew up here in Baltimore sharing a similar story, that the mother of one of her white friends at school tried to take the two girls to get ice cream, and they wouldn't serve her. So I think a lot of people have those types of experiences.
Thank you, Sharice. Thank you. Thank you for your story. Are there any others? If you can unmute yourself or raise your hand. Okay. There we go.
I was not here in the 60s and 70s, didn't get here till 2011, but I wanted to share about the Gwynn Oak Amusement Park. There was a woman who grew up at Hunting Ridge, Amy Singewald, and her last name now is Nathan, who wrote a book chronicling what happened there. It's called Round and Round Together. So I don't know if anybody, has interest in looking that up, but she did grow up at Hunting Ridge. That Gwynn Oak Amusement Park is not really very far from us at all. And I do know one member of our church, she has since died, but she told us about being there and people spitting on her.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. Are there any other stories?
I can share again that we were in a group called the Jackie Robinson Youth Council when we were teenagers, and we met at Sharp Street Methodist Church, and we were organized to picket places. So we picketed the Baltimore Gas and Electric Company, and we picketed the telephone company. And I specifically remember I wore a sign that said, "I can say hello, why can't you hire me?" And so it wasn't too scary a thing, because we were all together. We didn't have any negative experiences while we were doing it. But, it was something that we felt was important to do.
Okay, thank you. Next, we will have Susan, and then after Susan, we will have Janice Howard.
Thanks, folks. I just am really moved by the stories about the Gwynn Oak, because the story I've always heard was about our stated clerk, the highest level person in the Presbyterian Church, coming to that protest, and him being, and there's pictures of him standing in the front line there. But it reminds me your stories about the difference in his participation and other people, and particularly, the cost, right? I mean, he was arrested evidently that day, but a white man in a high position, I'm sure, was released within hours and had no negative repercussions that I know of. I mean, I'm sure were some people in the Presbyterian Church who weren't happy with it, but, he kept his job, he kept his standing. And in fact, people brag about it, to this day, about his standing there that day. So I'm really glad to hear some of the local history and to be reminded of the different consequences it has for people.
Thank you, Susan. And Janice?
Hi. I remember a couple of things. The Gwynn Oak incident, Reverend Graham was arrested at least once. He might have been arrested more than once for picketing to try to get Gwynn Oak open. And I also remember that after we were allowed in Gwynn Oak, the park was set on fire. I
Mhm.
believe at least once, maybe twice. And the thing was, we said, well, I guess they don't want us there, so they'd rather burn the park down than have us, come and attend the amusement park. So that was what we were, saying at the time, that they didn't want us there, so they set the park on fire. And I believe it was twice. I never got a chance to go. I never was really interested in attending, amusement parks. I didn't like them that much anyway. Other incidents that I remember, I attended Western High School downtown on Howard and Center Streets. That's where it was at the time. And I remember going to class and seeing people picketing, African Americans picketing Heck, at that time, I think it was Heck May Company, because we weren't allowed to try things on.
Oh,
I
that's
remember,
right.
I remember that happening while I was going. It was almost across the street from where I went to school. And I remember African Americans picketing Heck May Company, because we could not try things on. If you went in to buy something, you had to just guess whether it would fit, because you were not allowed to try things on. Later on, when I went to college, I had the opportunity of working at Heck Company. When I attended Goucher, so they had a sort of relationship. I don't know whether there was somebody on the board or whatever. And so as a Goucher student, I was allowed to later work there sometime around 68. I was allowed to work there. So I do remember things in Baltimore, that went on. I never was faced with anybody, calling me the N-word or refusing to serve me. But I do remember that we had a family friend. And when she would take us downtown, she would always take us to Bragger Gutman, because we could eat it at the Bragger Gutman, lunch counter. And I remember, her going there with us and taking us to buy clothes and sit at the lunch counter in Bragger Gutman, because I believe probably at that time, maybe Reed's was not allowing Black people to eat there. I also remember Northwood Shopping Center, because my husband attended Morgan. And I remember when they were picketing Northwood Shopping Center because of the Reeds, not allowing them. And also the Northwood Movie Theater did not
Right.
allow Blacks. I remember, Morgan students picketing those places.
Thank you, Janice. I'm curious, what location was the Heck Company that you worked at?
Same place that they were picketing when I was in high school, downtown on Howard Street. It was the same place. So in like a 3-year, maybe a 5-year span, it went from not allowing Blacks to buy clothes there to, opening it up to Blacks to buy clothes there. And like I said, I did work there one Christmas season. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Now we want to move to the third part of our agenda to get back to the PowerPoint. Part 3, what now? So now, the Presbyterian Baltimore Racial Justice. So I would like to ask Sharice Jordan Moore to talk about what's happening in the Presbyterian as far as dismantling racism.
Well, we do have, as many of you know, a racial dismantling racism team in the Baltimore Presbytery. And it is co-chaired by myself and Guy Moody, and Susan Krubel, who is in the call, is the staff person related to it. And one of the primary things that we have been doing is providing training, particularly for people who are clergy and are in leadership within the presbytery. And that training is required for people in those positions to do every 3 years. And so we had a first round and then ran into the pandemic, but we're happy to say that the second round of training is going to be on June 2nd. And it's an all-day training, which will be co-facilitated by representatives from the next church. And so we think it's really valuable for as many people in the presbytery to get this type of training, because we don't all come from the same place or the same set of experiences when it comes to dealing with anti-racism, or even knowing about racism, or knowing about both the history that Damella presented, but also about people's experiences and how, you know, it directly affects people of color. And also about, I think Annette was making the point that a lot of racism is systemic, that policies have been made that go way back that still are having effect on what happens to us today. So important for everybody to get that training and to have those experiences. And I know a lot of the, you know, some of the churches and so on have been doing educational series. ITL has done on a number of different subjects. But I think that one thing that we'll be looking to as we go on to the future is figuring out what we do with that information. So we're trained about racism, we know what it is, we have the will and the spirit, hopefully, to try to dismantle it. We have Matthew 25 initiative for the entire PCUSA, in which dismantling racism is one of the 3 targets for that. So how do we move to how we actually do something and work together to actually dismantle racism and move beyond the education phase and even the relationship phase, but which is very important for us to build personal relationships. One thing that I would add is that the General Assembly is coming up in June and July, and there are a few overtures that are being put before the General Assembly. And one of them is one that the Baltimore Presbytery did file a concurrence for. And just reading Deborah's question, I'll answer that. But and so Annette actually Annette Snyder will be speaking on behalf of the Presbytery of Baltimore in support of that anti-racism overture. And so we are making progress, but we're going to be digging in with members of our dismantling racism team. I understand that that with the Presbytery strategic plan, that in a lot of the listening sessions, people have discussed that dismantling racism is important to them. So it's something we'll see more of. And as for the next date of the training, after this June 2nd one, there will be one probably in October in the fall, where we've not quite pinned down the exact date yet, but that's when you should expect it to come up.
All right, thank you. And Annette, have a few comments on maybe the Giddens Lovejoy overture?
I was just going to speak to that a bit. So thanks, Cherise. The business session where that will be discussed, I believe, is on June 24th. Everyone or anyone can register for the meeting. I believe, so an overture is a particular position that the Presbytery wishes the people of PSA to take formally. In this case, the Giddings Lovejoy Presbytery in St. Louis, author of the overture. And I believe there are 9 or 10 presbyteries that have concurred, including ours. And I think it's really important to understand and read further about it. The overture is titled An Apology to Our African-American Brothers and Sisters for Slavery. So we have had a few of our Be More Human sessions talk about reparations back in the fall, the importance of apology to acknowledge and be able to move forward with. It's really exciting that the Presbytery is taking this on.
All right. And there's one more thing I would like to speak about. Shameless self-promotion. And share the screen here. This will stop others sharing screen. You want to get yes. And it is about the picnic at Knoebels Park and the registration. So if you go on this link, and I'm going to click on there, and it talks about the ITL picnic at Knoebels Park. Now, this picnic is Presbytery wide, okay? We've been doing all this work in the ITL on dismantling racism with the research project and all the other Be More Human series events that we had. So this is a time where during the summer on June 25th, that we could get together through faith and fellowship where we can have fun and have some great food. So on this link, and if you don't have the link, please get in touch with the BaltimorePresbytery.org, the website, or you could call me, 443-415-1652, where I could get you this link so you can register. It's from 9 to 9. And for the people who cannot drive to Knoebels, one thing about Knoebels, it's a free admission amusement park, and it also has free parking. And the big pavilion that we are reserving is also free. So all we're going to ask, if you can't drive there, we do have bus transportation that's leaving from Hunton Ridge Presbyterian Church on Emerson Avenue. And the fee for that is $20 per adult and $10 per child. So if you're not unable to drive or you don't want to drive out to Knoebels, you could use the bus service. Okay, what we want to do is fellowship as a presbytery. You know, the best way to really know someone is to interact with them and speak with them and to have fun with them. So this is a location that, like I said, shameless self-promotion, that I love. I love going to Knoebels. I think it's a great place to have large gatherings. They have all types of reunions, family reunions, and different companies have their company picnics there. And my vision for this picnic is to have it every year. And I want to get bigger and bigger and bigger so we can celebrate us. We can celebrate the Baltimore Presbytery. We can celebrate us being together, moving forward in Jesus Christ. So I want everyone here to spread the word about our picnic at Knoebels. Once you get on, you can just hit the click on the register, and then it'll go right to the tickets. It's not really tickets, but we want to get a count of how many people are coming because it will be catered. We will have food there. And then if you need to get on the bus, you just click on here, and then it would ask you how many adults, how many children, and then it would go forward into collecting the money for it. So let me get out of here. And that's it. Where's the stop sharing? US sharing screen. Okay, let me move this. Stop share. There we go. So that's what the ITL is doing for the month of June. So we want to have this big picnic where we can fellowship as a presbytery. So spread the word, Western Maryland to the Eastern Shore. We would like everyone to be there. Okay. Are there any questions, any comments that anyone have?
Kenny, I just want to remind everybody to stay tuned for our fall Be More Human series, where we explore our topic further, because we'll have some sessions to talk about how our research into our individual churches sort of stands against the timeline and information that we provided tonight. And also want to remind the ITL member church members who are participating today that there's a lot of good seats at the table to participate in the loop planning. So please give Kenny a shout out and keep an ear to your emails about our upcoming meetings. We'd love to have you join us.
Yes, my vision is to at least have one representative of each of the churches to be on our steering committee so they can spread the word, really grow that communication, and also bring new ideas to the ITL so we can work on them and move forward. Okay, again, we want to thank Damella for all the work that she's been doing on our research project. And like I said, this is just the I call it the draft. It goes into the history, the racial history of Baltimore. And when we finish our research project, it will also include what part our churches, our ITL churches, played in that history of Baltimore. So I want to thank everyone for coming. May God bless you and watch over you and keep you.